June 1st. It was a particularly pleasant evening, perhaps more than just pleasant. John and his wife Louise enjoyed a wonderful dinner in a cozy restaurant with a warm atmosphere. The main course, duck, was cooked to perfection with a crispy exterior hiding juicy, tender meat infused with subtle aromas of spices and herbs. The wine they chose was expensive and refined, with a rich bouquet and a velvety aftertaste that perfectly complemented the taste of the dish. For dessert, they were served a chocolate mint cake that was unbeatable. A delicate chocolate layer with a refreshing hint of mint created a harmonious combination of flavors, making their hearts beat faster with pleasure. After dinner, the couple headed to a small club located next to the restaurant to continue the evening with dancing. The club was cozy and stylish, with dim lighting and live music creating the perfect environment for dancing. Louise has always loved to dance, and this evening she looked especially attractive and confident. Her movements were graceful and fluid, her body gliding easily and elegantly across the dance floor to the beat of the music. She attracted the attention of those around her with her charm and charisma, causing openly admiring glances from many men, as well as several women who could not help but notice her attractive energy. Louise was well aware of the effect she had on those around her, but it didn't bother her. All her attention was focused on the man she was dancing with, John, her husband. She flirted with him tenderly, showing off that playful and affectionate side that she thought he liked. Her body smoothly wriggled and moved to the beat of the melody, conveying emotions and creating an atmosphere of intimacy and warmth. She tried to excite him, hoping that tonight would be special, that today everything would change for the better, and their relationship would return to those happy moments that were before. Louise put her heart and soul into every dance step, wanting this moment to be special for both of them. She believed that their love could overcome any difficulties, and this night should become a symbol of their desire for mutual understanding and harmony. There was a burning desire inside her that tonight would bring a new spark to their relationship, bringing back those warm and joyful feelings that had once bound them together. Louise was a truly beautiful woman. Her slender figure was gracefully emphasized by natural curves, creating a harmonious and attractive silhouette. She had long, slender legs that moved gracefully across the dance floor, as if they were made for the most graceful dance steps. Her lush head of fiery red hair shimmered in the light, adding brightness and liveliness to her image. Approaching her 35th birthday, Louise looked younger than her years, being 3 years younger than John, her husband. John, with his thick dark hair, always wore a slight smile on his face, which gave him a friendly and charming appearance. His height, 6'2", made him a conspicuous figure in any company, and he was only slightly taller than Louise when she put on heels, which added harmony and symmetry to the pair. Even though John didn't have the same natural sense of rhythm as Louise and sometimes looked a little awkward, he liked her dance moves, and she appreciated his sincere attempts to follow her steps. His efforts were obvious, and Louise knew he was putting his whole heart into it for her, which made her feel proud and grateful. This couple especially appreciated the unexpected romantic evening that John organized for them. Louise felt his love as deeply and sincerely as she loved him herself. That evening, she felt that all of John's efforts were aimed at strengthening their relationship and creating unforgettable moments together. She enjoyed every moment spent next to him and thanked fate for such a caring and attentive partner. The desire grew in her heart that this evening would become a symbol of their mutual love and devotion, strengthening their connection and filling their relationship with new, bright emotions. Louise admired the way John tried to make this evening special, thinking through every detail to the smallest detail. His attention to detail, from the choice of restaurant to the dance music, reflected his concern and desire to make her happy. Later, they walked hand in hand along the slowly flowing river, enjoying the soft moonlight reflecting on the calm water. It was only a few miles from the restaurant to their home, but every step seemed filled with meaning on this magical evening. The night was pleasantly warm, with a light breeze that gently touched their faces, creating a feeling of freshness and comfort, ideal for a walk under the starry sky. Louise laid her head on John's shoulder, feeling his strong and reliable support. She enjoyed the tranquility of the moment, listening to the whisper of water and the quiet sounds of the night city. She was overwhelmed with a feeling of happiness and slight intoxication from a magnificent evening. She could still feel the pulsating rhythm of the music coming from afar, and it gave her a sense of belonging to the magic they had just experienced. She wished that the evening would last longer so that they could continue to enjoy each other and these moments without rushing, but time flew by and tomorrow they both had to return to their daily duties and work. "Thank you for tonight," she said in a soft, warm voice as their house began to appear on the horizon, illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps. "It was a pleasure for me. Hope you liked it," John answered, looking at her with sincere care and tenderness in his eyes. "It was wonderful and pleasantly unexpected," Louise admitted, smiling and feeling her heart fill with warmth from his words. "And that's not all, honey," he said, raising his eyebrows slightly and making a gesture as if smoking an imaginary cigar, parodying a funny scene from old Groucho Marx movies. His playing was light and casual, adding a touch of humor to their conversation. 20 minutes later, Louise stood opposite John, and there was tension between them, filled with anticipation. She dropped her shoulders, letting the dress slide to the floor, leaving her in elegant lingerie that showed off her figure. She reached for the bra clasp, but John gently stopped her hands, as if he wanted to delay this moment. His gaze expressed admiration and awe. She was beautiful, and he was in no hurry to destroy this image. John took her hand and gently led her to the bed. He sat her down and leaned down to kiss her, trying to express in this kiss everything he felt: love, tenderness, and desire. Louise answered, and in that brief moment, it seemed as if there were no barriers left between them. But gradually John felt something change in her mood. Her movements became less confident, and although she tried, he felt her inner tension. "Thank you for tonight," she whispered, as if trying to fill the silence with words that could fix something. He smiled, but the smile was more an attempt to hide his own disappointment. He wanted to make this moment special, but he knew something was wrong. "Hold me, please," she said, her voice sounding almost pleading. John lay down next to her, gently put his arm around her shoulders, and hugged her tightly. He didn't say anything, just held her, trying to show her that she was safe next to him, that he wouldn't demand what she wasn't ready to give. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay, don't worry," he replied, but Louise caught in his voice the notes of disappointment and depression that he was trying to hide. She snuggled closer to him, feeling his warmth comfort her, but her own thoughts continued to torment her. She wanted to say something, to explain, but did not know how to find the words. Instead, she fell silent, holding back the tears that wanted to burst out. Like so many times before, she simply tried to ignore her feelings, burying them deep inside, hoping that one day things would get easier. John could not fall asleep for a long time after his wife fell asleep. His thoughts were preoccupied with her refusal. He tried to be understanding and sympathetic, but it had been over 2 years since they last had sex, at least what he considered real sex, and he was growing increasingly frustrated. Fully aroused and head filled with desires, he desperately needed release. He kissed Louise's forehead and carefully removed his hand from under her neck. Slowly, so as not to wake her, he climbed out of bed. He felt a little ashamed and dirty, a grown man, 38 years old, sneaking into the bathroom in the middle of the night to please himself. But this was the only way to release the accumulated tension. He thought about his wife, how hard it must be for her, and he felt shame and guilt. Not because of what he was going to do, but because of the reason why he organized this evening. Because for the first time in the 12 years of their life together, he seriously thought about cheating. 2 months ago, John worked in the design department of a small engineering company. More precisely, he was in this department. The owner of the company, Bob Stevenson, was involved in business, receiving contracts, preparing commercial proposals, and so on. Jen, a pleasant middle-aged woman, worked as a part-time secretary and general assistant. John himself handled the planning, design, and all technical issues. He also participated in site meetings and liaised with clients. His schedule was flexible, and as long as the work was done properly, he was effectively his own boss. The company was small, with 10 field operators, but successful and always busy. A recent increase in workload led to the decision that John needed an assistant. That's how he met Josie. Despite her 27 years, Josie Hatfield was well prepared and full of enthusiasm. She was blonde, sweet and cheerful, confident and outgoing. She was easy to get along with, and after just a couple of hours of working together, John felt like he had known her all his life. Conversations between them developed naturally, light jokes arose naturally, and he began to notice that he was smiling more and more often. After a few days, he found himself looking forward to the day at work, and after a week, he felt sad that he had to spend the weekend without her company. He also realized that he had a slight crush on her, but he was married and loved his wife very much. He also respected their working relationship and was aware of the age difference, so despite his attraction, John acted like a true gentleman. In the following weeks, everything went smoothly. Josie settled into her place, and she and John became good friends. She met Louise, and they got along well. Louise even invited Josie to dinner twice. John was pleased with Josie's work and tried not to notice that he was spending 50 hours a week in the company of a very attractive woman. However, his reminder came when Louise brought up a topic he had been trying to ignore. "Josie called me today," Louise said. They sat in the living room, relaxing. John was reading a book, trying not to pay attention to some reality program that Louise was watching on TV. "About?" he replied, sounding uninterested, his eyes never leaving his book. "She's organizing a bachelorette party next weekend. I wanted to know if I would go." John put the book on his lap and looked at it. "I thought we were going to your parents' house this weekend," he said, folding the corner of the page to mark the location. Louise noticed this and looked at him disapprovingly. "We're getting ready, so I told her I couldn't go. But it was nice of her to invite me." "Yes, she's a good girl," he replied. "Yes, good. I like her, and you like her," Louise said casually, but with some special tone. "I said she was cute," John replied, feeling like he needed to defend himself, although he didn't understand why. "No, I mean you really like her," Louise emphasized. John looked at her sideways and suddenly understood what she meant. "Don't talk nonsense. She's young enough to be my daughter." "Who's talking nonsense here? She is 27 years old," Louise exclaimed. "Even so, why do you think she might be interested in me?" "You're an attractive man," she said, and John laughed, embarrassed. "I'm a woman," Louise continued, "and I know what I'm talking about. Do you think a beauty like me would marry you if you were ugly?" She moved her hand in front of her, as if emphasizing her body. John laughed again, shaking his head, but Louise insisted. "Just be careful," she said. This conversation led to another one, which happened 2 weeks later, after another unsuccessful attempt at intimacy. This conversation will have a greater impact on their marriage than either John or Louise could have imagined. "Do you want a divorce?" Louise asked quietly. She sat upright in bed, leaning against the backrest, clasping her knees with her hands. Her nightgown barely reached mid-thigh. "What?" John wasn't sure if he heard correctly. He lay next to him on his back, covering his eyes with his hand. He tried to hide his disappointment and suppress his irritation. He loved Louise more than anything in the world. He knew it wasn't her fault and tried to be understanding, but her constant refusals over the past 2 years had gradually worn out his patience. "Do you want a divorce? I won't resist. You can find someone else who—" "Of course, I don't want any damn divorce. Why did you even think about this?" John interrupted her, regretting his angry tone. He propped himself up on his elbows so he could see her face. Tears sparkled in her eyes, and he felt guilty. He sat down, put his arm around her shoulders, and kissed the top of her head. "Oh, honey, don't cry. Why should I leave you?" "I love you, I will never leave you," he said, and then, trying to soften the situation, he added, "You won't get rid of me that easily. Now I'm yours forever." Louise smiled faintly. "I just thought—" she began, but paused to wipe away a tear. "I know how hard it is for you, and I'm afraid it won't get better. If anything, things are getting worse." John pulled her head to his chest, stroking her hair. It was hard for him. He couldn't deny it. Disappointment and resentment were eating away at him from the inside, despite his efforts to hide it. He wanted to tell Louise that it didn't matter and that everything would be fine, but he didn't see how that was possible. However, he didn't want to lie to her, so he just hugged her tighter and said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere." Louise kissed his chest gratefully. She didn't want a divorce either. Her words were driven by guilt, a desire to give John a way out, but deep down she prayed that he wouldn't take advantage of it. There was another possibility, no less painful, but she felt she had to mention it. Maybe you could find someone. I don't know. Maybe meet a woman, just for sex. It doesn't have to be serious, not an affair, nothing like that, she muttered. John pulled her head away so he could see her face. "Do you want me to go to a call girl?" he asked in disbelief. No, I just thought that maybe you could meet someone." She trailed off. And what next? Walk up to a woman in a pub and ask her to take off her panties. He interrupted her, almost laughing. Louise remained serious. "No, I didn't mean that. You know that's not it. But maybe dating sites or apps. Joyce said there are all kinds of people there." "Well, of course, Joyce would know, wouldn't she?" he responded sarcastically. Joyce, although a sweet woman, was famous for her tendency to gossip and be curious. "Listen, I want you. I don't want to register on some dating site and end up on a blind date with a guy who pretends to be a girl or with a woman who posts photos from 20 years ago." He knew that he was speaking unfairly, that there were a lot of decent people on dating sites, but he didn't I could imagine myself in such a situation. "Besides, I don't need anyone. I'm happy with you. But maybe if your sister suggested, I would think." He began, but did not have time to finish, because Louise playfully but noticeably slapped him on the chest. "Don't even think about it," she said with a smile, but the warning was quite serious. She became serious again. "True, if you feel that. Well, if you need it, I will understand. I won't stop you. Do you want me to have sex with another woman? Do you really think I can do this?" John didn't believe she was serious. "No, I wouldn't want that," she said firmly, then, sighing, added, "It would be terrible. But I would understand." John sank back onto the pillow, pulling Louise towards him. He was still hugging her, and her head was resting on his shoulder. "This won't happen," he whispered, hugging her tighter and closing his eyes. Nothing more was said. Louise was terribly afraid that John might actually do such a thing and hoped that this would never happen. But she knew he deserved some form of satisfaction, and if it took another woman to get it, she would get through it. However, as she lay in the dark and waited for sleep, she bitterly wished that she would not bring up the topic. John also could not sleep, replaying this strange conversation in his head. He never had any intention of looking for a mistress. He hadn't even thought about it before. Why did Louise mention this? He was sure that this wouldn't happen, so he rolled over, deciding to forget this whole conversation. But the seed had already been planted. Life went on. Neither John nor Louise mentioned that conversation, and it seemed that the topic was forgotten. Over the next few weeks, everything went as usual. Sex was not a topic of discussion. Both knew that raising the topic would only lead to disappointment and dissatisfaction, so they continued to live as if everything was fine, hoping that somehow, someday, their problem would go away on its own. Louise is already used to doing without intimacy. She had not experienced any satisfaction from sex for 2 years. She still had the same desires as any other woman, but self-gratification became her only option. John tried to help, but cold fear continued to squeeze her chest. Therefore, most often she relied on her own fingers to somehow achieve release. It was far from ideal, but from her point of view, there was simply no other choice. She kept her desires inside, putting on a mask of courage and pretending that everything was fine. For his part, John never insisted on intimacy. He understood his wife's problem. She had a phobia and felt the same pity for her as she did for him. However, he managed, and his forced abstinence was easier to bear than he expected. He, too, always had a way to relieve tension at hand. Sometimes, however, this put a lot of pressure on him. and he spent the day or evening thinking about the injustice of life. He wanted to scream in frustration and self-pity, and sometimes, in his darkest moments, he even thought about alternative options. Fortunately, such attacks were short-lived, and each time he assured himself that, no matter how difficult it was, his love for Louise would help him cope. However, her proposal, made a few weeks earlier, haunted him. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, no matter how confident he was in his loyalty, the thought kept popping into his head. At work, he couldn't help but look at Josie differently. She was his attractive assistant, and to be honest, she was sexy as hell. John knew very well that he had great sympathy for her, but he was much older than her. The age difference was 11 years, and although it wasn't much, John couldn't imagine that a young woman like Josie would find him attractive. But then he remembered Louise's warning and began to wonder, is this possible? Does she really like him? However, in the end, it didn't matter. No matter how disappointed he was, how attractive Josie was, or whether she liked him or not, he loved Louise and would never cheat on her. But fate decreed otherwise, and events began to unfold in a completely unexpected way literally 2 weeks later. John just finished working on a project for one of his new clients. It was midday on Wednesday. He looked at his watch. 3:30. It's too late to start a new project, but not so late that you can't celebrate the completion with a glass of beer. Do you want to go for a drink? He asked, throwing his pen on the table with an air of finality. Josie smiled. Can we do this? Of course we can, he replied. Bob wouldn't mind. In fact, he probably would have gone with them, but he wasn't in the office that day. Come on, we deserve it, he said, throwing his jacket over his shoulders. The Red Lion pub was only a 3-minute walk away and was fairly quiet midweek. They found a table in a secluded corner. John bought himself a beer and Josie a glass of wine. 2 hours later, both had drunk more than they had planned, but they were enjoying their time with each other, and the conversation flowed easily. You know, I never thought it would be like this, Josie said. I mean work. I thought you only hired me because of my looks, but you all are really very nice. No, that's not why we hired you. But yes, you are beautiful, John said. Am I beautiful? Very beautiful, she asked again and laughed at her bad grammar. You are beautiful. Even damn beautiful, John said. Josie laughed again. Beautiful? Yes, I'm fucking gorgeous, she said. And when John laughed, she looked at him seriously. What? Don't you think so? No, that's not the point. You are beautiful. Damn gorgeous, even. It's just that Louise said almost the same thing a couple of weeks ago. What? She said I'm fucking gorgeous. No. Well, no. I think she would say that. But she said about herself that she was great, he explained, feeling slightly dizzy from the alcohol. I see, she replied, and John felt the need to clarify the situation. She said that you were very nice and that I liked you, and even being half drunk, he regretted his words. Josie laughed and blushed slightly. John noticed this and suddenly felt awkward. The beer loosened his tongue, and he said too much. Now his words sounded like cheap flirting, and he was afraid that she would think badly of him. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm not trying to flirt with you. It's just what my wife said, he explained with difficulty. It's okay, don't worry. I'm a big girl, I know what you mean, she replied, placing her hand on his thigh and squeezing it gently in support. John smiled uncertainly and nodded. And by the way, she's right. I really like you, she added and went to the toilet, swaying her hips slightly as she walked away. By silent mutual agreement, they did not bring up the topic again, at least for that moment. But the truth was clear. They had crossed a line, and now it was affecting their behavior. At work, they continued to maintain strictly professional communication, but there was an underlying tension between them. Their fingers touched as they handed over documents, their gazes lingered a little longer than usual, they smiled at each other for no apparent reason. And exactly a week later, Josie raised the issue again. Shall we go for a drink today? She asked. She leaned back in her chair, clasping her hands behind her head and arching her back slightly. The movement pulled her shirt up, emphasizing her breasts. John involuntarily noticed this, looking up from the document. "Should I have a drink?" he asked again. "Today is Wednesday, our drinks night," she explained. "Ah, ah, okay," John replied. They had only been to the pub together once, but Josie seemed to consider it a regular tradition. He didn't want to make it a habit, but he saw no reason to deny himself a little pleasure every now and then. "I think we need to talk about this, don't we?" Josie said. John understood what was being said. Although he did not answer anything, he simply shrugged his shoulders, but inside he felt a strange excitement. They sat again at the same table in the same pub, drinking the same drinks. John a glass of ale, Josie a glass of white wine. They talked about everyday things for about 20 minutes until John finally asked a question. "So, what did you want to talk about?" Josie put her glass down, leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, and looked into his eyes. "I like you and you like me, but there are reasons why this shouldn't happen," she said, as if discussing a work problem. John put his glass on the table. Her directness took him by surprise. Although he had guessed that this might be the reason for their meeting, he did not expect her to be so open. He straightened his tie, trying to buy time to think about his answer. "Because I'm married," he suggested. "I meant more that we work together," she replied. "So it doesn't bother you that I'm married?" "And this too." "I said reasons in the plural," she clarified. "I'm not sure I want to cheat on Louise," John said, looking at his glass. "I would be disappointed in you if you did," Josie replied. "So you're suggesting we meet to discuss the possibility of an affair, but you'll be disappointed in me if I agree?" John asked with a puzzled look on his face. "Who said something about the novel?" She answered. "Isn't that what we're talking about?" He asked again. "The novel sounds so vulgar, as if it were something secretive and shameful," she said. "So what do you want?" asked John, who was having a hard time understanding why this conversation was happening. "Nothing. Just wanted to point out the obvious." "I thought we needed to discuss this," she replied. "I don't know what you want to hear from me. Yes, we like each other, but neither you nor I want an affair. I definitely don't want to cheat on Louise, so I don't know what to discuss," he said. "Agree? Let's just leave it at that, okay? How about another glass?" Josie suggested, raising her empty glass. John walked towards the bar and Josie took the moment to go to the ladies' room. When they returned to the table, both were silent. The conversation seemed to dry up until Josie asked the question that had been bothering both of them. "So what are we going to do about it?" John set his glass down and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What can we do? We have work to think about," he said. "Not to mention Louise," she reminded. "You're right, not to mention Louise," he echoed. Then he sighed heavily and added, "Actually, we haven't been close for a long time." Josie looked at him, and he felt the need to explain. "I can't remember the last time we had sex." "She's just pushing me away now," John said, feeling guilty for betraying Louise's trust, although there was some truth in his words. "I'm not going to be a pity sex man," Josie said sharply. "No, I didn't suggest that. I don't know why I even said that." He began, but then shook his head and fell silent. John sat slouched, holding his glass in both hands. Josie shifted position and placed her hands on top of his. "Don't ruin your marriage for a couple of minutes with me," she said sympathetically. She had no doubt that he was honest, but she had no intention of becoming his girlfriend on the side. "Listen, I think we should go home and think about everything when we're sober," she concluded. John raised his head and smiled. "How is it that you are younger than me, but 100 times more intelligent?" "Because I'm a woman," she said and laughed, while John frowned. The next day at work, the atmosphere was awkward, to say the least. Neither Josie nor John wanted to mention the last party, but they couldn't forget about what happened. There was minimal communication between them until late in the day, when John returned from the office of his boss, Bob Stevenson. He walked through the doorway just as Josie was leaving his office. Both were lost in their thoughts and weren't looking where they were going, so they collided. John stepped back sharply, and Josie, being lighter and smaller, staggered and almost fell. On instinct, John reached out to hold her and pulled her towards him. She looked up at him. "Sorry," she said and laughed because John said the same thing at the same time. When they calmed down, Josie noticed that they were still standing very close to each other. She looked at John's hands, which were still holding her shoulders. John took the hint and loosened his grip, but instead of letting her go, he pulled her closer and their lips met. It was thoughtless, instinctive, dictated by passion. They stood, half in the corridor, half in the office, kissing each other deeply and passionately. A minute later, they broke the kiss, but were immediately drawn to each other again. Finally, Josie pulled away. "Not here," she said, taking his hand and pulling him through the office, slamming the door, and then dragging him into a small office storage closet. In a cramped room, with the door closed, they were literally pressed against each other. Their lips met again in a kiss. Then, as if something had broken inside, he sighed heavily and weakened. "Sorry, I can't," he said, carefully buttoning her shirt so as not to touch the exposed skin. "Sorry, Josie. I don't know," he said, standing at the window and looking outside, but not seeing anything. With one hand, he rubbed his forehead, and with the other, he leaned against the glass, as if trying to find support. "It's okay," she said. She stood at the open closet door, straightening and tucking in her shirt. "Sorry," he repeated again. "It's not fair to you, and to Louise. It's just not fair." Josie came up behind him and put her hands on his shoulders. There was sympathy in her voice. "Don't worry, everything is fine. I'm glad we stopped," she said. He turned to face her and smiled shyly. "That was a little cheesy, wasn't it?" she added. "When that happens, I want it to be clean and nice, not in the closet. And you have to be sure of that this is really what you want." John watched silently as she collected her papers and left to finish her business. He turned back to the window. Thoughts swirled in his head. Will he be able to continue resisting temptation? Will there be anything bad about it just once? Louise had even hinted that he might do something like that, although he doubted that she meant it seriously. But hadn't he already crossed the line by doing what just happened? Josie made it clear that she was ready, but the decision was his. He wasn't looking for romance, but he was desperate for something. Just once. Is it really that bad? Am I asking too much? He muttered under his breath. That night, John tried again to hook Louise up, but to be honest, it was done without much enthusiasm, and he was not surprised when she once again turned her back on him. So, in a desperate attempt to regain his lost passion, he began planning a romantic evening for both of them, hoping for a night of seduction. June 1st. It so happened that late at night John was sitting on the toilet while his wife slept in the next room, and he was thinking about sleeping with another woman. At first he felt anger. Anger at Louise for her constant refusals, anger at himself for blaming her, and anger at Josie for seducing him. But that anger quickly turned to guilt because he knew he only had himself to blame. Louise couldn't control her feelings and her phobias, and Josie was just saying what was on her mind. The problem was with him, he was weak. He could not cope with his desires. Then came self-pity. Louise's problems were the reason for his current situation, and it was not his fault, but he had to suffer. Josie may have only stated the obvious, but she made it clear that she was ready, and that made him doubtful and made his life more difficult. Damn it. Before her, he was doing great until she threw this challenge into his life. When the excitement subsided, John felt completely confused and did not know what to do next. He returned to the bedroom. Louise was breathing quietly and muttering something inaudibly in her sleep. He looked at her. She was so beautiful, and he loved her so much. John kissed her forehead and then lay down next to her, but in his head, the image of her wife gradually merged with Josie's smiling face. As the old saying goes, the morning is wiser than the evening. And indeed, in the morning, everything seemed much simpler. John realized that his experiences yesterday were caused by self-pity, intensified by alcohol. In the bright sunlight of a warm summer day, everything looked completely different. He laughed at something Louise said and asked himself again and again why he even needed another woman if she was there. However, This feeling of satisfaction lasted only 3 days. John avoided the topic of what happened in the closet with Josie, but the tension in the air was undeniable. It was only a matter of time before one of them said something, and it would change everything. "How are you and Louise?" Josie asked, pouring coffee from a pot that sat on a shelf in the corner of the office. John looked up from the document he was reading. "What? Louise? Yes, she's doing well. Why are you asking?" "I didn't ask how she was doing. I wanted to know how things are going with you now. But if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay." John understood what Josie was saying, and although it was a private matter, he felt he had to give her an answer. "No, I don't mind. In fact, everything is about the same. Josie placed the cup of coffee in front of John and returned to her seat. "So, still no intimacy," she said directly. John scratched his lips, tried to hide his embarrassment, and answered, "No, there is no intimacy." "God, you must be very upset. Any ideas?" And she made a small fist, hinting at the hint. John smiled and shook his head, and Josie laughed. "Sorry, I'm just kidding. It's okay, I don't mind. But yeah, I'm really frustrated. Any suggestions?" he said and clenched his tongue internally. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "Stop apologizing. I'm not a child, and I have a proposal," she said. When it became clear that he was not falling for her tricks, she added, "I think we both know what we want. No obligations, just two curious people. The decision is yours." John didn't know what to answer. This moment had been constantly on his mind for the past 2 weeks, but he had tried to avoid it and was not prepared. Josie took him by surprise. He looked at the woman in front of him. She was truly beautiful. But Louise was also beautiful, and did he really want to cheat on his wife? But if he did, would it be so bad? Just once. To relieve the tension. In the end, he himself organized a date night with this idea in mind as a final test for himself and Louise. Probably, on her part, this would only help them, ease the tension that was growing between them, at least on his part. Almost convincing himself that he was doing the right thing and helping his marriage, he cleared his throat to clear his throat. "So what do we do? Rent a room or something like a hotel?" Josie smiled and her body seemed to relax. It was difficult to ask this question, but she couldn't think about anything else since that day in the closet. Why John had such an influence on her, she didn't know. She didn't love him and didn't want an affair. It was just some kind of attraction. And if it really didn't hurt, just once, not realizing how much her thoughts echoed his, she said, "Why don't we take the day off? I live only 20 minutes from here." And even though she was younger and John was effectively her boss, they both knew she was in control of the situation. Taking his hand, she walked him without resistance out of the room, to her car, and on the 20-minute drive to her apartment. "You can do what you want," Josie said. "Oh." They stood face to face in the center of the sparsely furnished but cozy living room. The apartment was larger than John had expected, with 2 spacious bedrooms and an open kitchen living room. A small balcony overlooked the well-kept common garden on the ground floor. Josie poured them a glass of white wine and pressed a few icons on her phone to play background music. John felt like a nervous teenager on a first date. He smiled at Josie hesitantly. The image of Louise flashed through his mind, and he almost panicked and wanted to run away. Fantasizing and talking about extramarital intimacy is one thing, but actually acting on it is quite another. He wasn't sure he could do it, and was about to apologize to Josie and leave when she approached and, standing on tiptoe, touched his lips. Everything happened naturally. Josie put the glasses away and began to unbutton the buttons of her shirt. John followed suit, quickly taking off his jacket. He also began to unbutton his shirt when Josie stopped him. "Undress me first," she said seductively. "I want to be naked while you're still dressed." John smiled and slowly unbuttoned her shirt, revealing the top of her clothing. They made love. The next morning, John entered the office in high spirits. Josie was sitting at her desk, reading a trade magazine with her back to the door when she didn't hear him approach. She flinched in surprise and shock when he reached over her shoulders and touched her. "It was only meant to be this once," she said, grabbing his wrists and pulling his hands away. John froze, suddenly feeling embarrassed. "Sorry," he said. For the first time, he had the confidence to take the initiative, but it seemed he had made a big mistake. Josie stood up and turned to him. "I said it was only once," she repeated. "No, I'm sorry about that. You know," he tried to explain, putting his hands forward as if they were to blame, as if he could not control them. "You can't just grab me," she said, her face red with anger. "Sorry," John apologized again. But then Josie suddenly smiled and grabbed his wrists again, pulling his hands back. "It should be done like this," she said, and then, coming closer, she kissed him. "I was only teasing you," she whispered. John relaxed and kissed her back. His hands remained on her. He was fascinated by this feeling. John couldn't help but compare her body to his wife's, and although Josie was younger, she wasn't better, just different. Different in warmth and shape, different in taste. He liked these differences, since it had been so long since he had felt or tasted someone other than his wife. "Close the door," Josie said, breaking the kiss. "We can't, not here. What if someone comes? What if we get caught?" John asked, but made no attempt to remove his hands from her chest. "That's the beauty of it," she said with a smile. John reluctantly let go of her and walked over to the door, double-checking the handle to make sure it wouldn't open, then inspected the blinds on the window, separating his office from the hallway. He knew that almost nothing could be seen through this glass, but he wanted to be sure that no one would notice them. "Come on, get to work, slave," Josie said. When he turned around, he gasped, surprised and a little shocked. In the few seconds he spent closing the door, she managed to take off her panties and unbutton her shirt. She sat on the edge of his desk. She looked so beautiful, provocative, sexy that John's knees buckled. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. John readily complied. Driving home later that day, John reflected on what he had done. He had acted like some kind of sexually obsessed fool, doing everything Josie told him to do. No, that's not true. She didn't ask, she commanded, and he obeyed, and he liked it. It was something new, incredibly embarrassing, but still exciting. He imagined Louise waiting for him at home, and a sharp wave of guilt pierced his mind. But at the same time, he felt inspired, and the memories of the events with Josie still excited him. He remembered her words. It was only meant to be once, and although she was only teasing, there was truth in it. But now everything has changed. A one-time act of mercy had become a need, a weak craving, like the time when he was young and went to a nightclub for the first time, danced with a girl for the first time, held her close, felt the excitement and trepidation of a new experience, and could not wait to repeat it. Now he felt the same excitement, but this time it was tinged with sadness, because as good as it felt, he knew it was wrong. "You're kind of playful today," Louise said with a smile. She stood at the kitchen table, finishing preparing the cake for baking. John returned home and found her there. He came up from behind, hugged her waist, and kissed her neck. "Because I have a hot wife," he said. Louise smiled at the compliment and turned her head to meet his lips. They kissed passionately for a few seconds, John holding her tightly to him, and Louise, with dough-stained hands, holding them in the air on either side of her head. "I need to put this in the oven," she said, a little hoarsely. "Why don't you turn on the shower?" she added between tender kisses. John smiled. It was true. He felt very excited, probably because of the day he spent with Josie, but also because of thoughts about his wife. Ever since he left the office, he had been thinking about her and how he needed to make her happy, to prove to her, as well as to himself, that he still loved her. He quickly hugged her tighter and hoped that this time everything would go well. "Great," he said. Then, after giving her one last kiss, he reluctantly released her and went upstairs to the bedroom. John turned on the shower and undressed, waiting for the water to heat up. Standing under the stream, he enjoyed the hot water, allowing it to relax his body. Soon the shower door opened slightly, and Louise entered the bathroom. She was naked, and although John had seen her like this many times, today he thought she was especially beautiful. He gallantly extended his hand, helping her into the shower stall, as if inviting her to dance. Louise hugged him from behind, avoiding too close contact, and gently rested her chin on his shoulder. Her movements were timid, but there was a sense of tenderness in them. She knew that John wanted to be closer, but because of her inner fears, she could not overcome the barrier that had long become an insurmountable wall for her. She kissed his cheek, running her hand along his waist, careful not to touch his more intimate areas. John, feeling her tension, decided not to rush her. Instead, he took her hand, pressing it against his stomach to let her feel his warmth and support. "It's okay," he said softly, turning to look into her eyes. "You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable." Louise smiled slightly, grateful for his patience. She felt her fears and doubts gradually dissolve in this quiet support, although she could not completely let them go. She hugged John tighter, leaning on him. At this moment, she wanted only one thing: to feel that she was accepted for who she was. He ran his hand along her back, allowing his touches to be only comforting, not demanding. The water washed away the tension that had built up between them, and both silently enjoyed a rare moment of intimacy in which words were not needed. When they turned off the shower and stepped out, Louise wrapped herself in a towel, and John gently put his arm around her shoulders. They looked at each other, and emotions were visible in their gazes, a mixture of love, gratitude, and slight sadness. He knew it was difficult for her, but he was willing to wait so that she could feel comfortable around him again. On Monday morning, Josie came into work feeling a little excited. All weekend, all she could think about was how she and John would react to her new role. She often fantasized about a man willing to do her bidding, but had never made it a reality before. Now, as she sat at her desk and waited for her boss slave to arrive, she began to imagine all the elaborate games they could play. John showed up about 10 minutes later, looking a little nervous and unsure of where their relationship was going now. He greeted politely, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down at his desk, sorting through his morning mail. "I enjoyed Friday," Josie said, breaking a long silence during which they were both intent on their work. "What about you?" John looked up from the architectural drawing he was studying. He looked over his glasses at Josie, who was chewing on the end of her pencil. The gesture wasn't overtly sexual, but combined with her question and the memory of Friday, John began to feel aroused. Yeah, me too," he could only mutter. Josie stood up and walked slowly towards him. She sat on the edge of his desk, her knee touching his arm. "I think I'd like to do it again," she said quietly. John swallowed, his throat was dry, and he coughed, trying to control his anxiety. I'm not sure this is a good idea," he said, then, realizing that he might sound like a refusal, hastened to add, "Here, at work. I enjoyed it too, but we can't do this at work." "That's not what I meant," Josie said. "I just thought we could have fun sometimes." "I don't know, Josie. What about Louise?" "I feel guilty," he replied. Josie pulled away, but her smile didn't fade. She was disappointed that he didn't jump at the opportunity, but on the other hand, she liked that he still thought about his wife. At that moment, she also felt a pang of conscience. "Yes, you are right. It's not fair to her," she said, running her hand gently over his cheek before returning to her desk. John also felt slightly disappointed. Part of him wished she would continue to insist, but he lowered his head to hide his emotions. The silence in the office became more and more tense until he decided to interrupt it. "I can't love you," he said without looking up. When there was no answer, he looked up and saw Josie looking at him. "I can't love you. I will always love Louise." "It would only be sex," he said, although deep down he knew that it would still be cheating. Josie slowly stood up and walked closer to him. "Thank God," she said, a smile playing on her lips again. "I don't mind sleeping with you, but I couldn't fall in love with an old weirdo like you." John laughed. The laughter was genuine, partly from humor and partly from relief. Josie walked around his desk and stood very close, just a few centimeters from him. Her eyes sparkled and her breath could be felt on his skin. John raised his head to meet her gaze and froze. She looked down at him, her hair falling around her face and her lips parted slightly. John and Josie left the office early again to spend time at her apartment. They both knew they could catch up on the work later, but John insisted it shouldn't become a habit. Josie, as always, took the lead, from their ride together in her car to the way she guided him in her desires once he was on her bed. This was something new for John before. He had always been the leader in his relationship with his wife Louise, always initiating intimacy. However, Louise had been having problems lately, and he realized that what he was doing to Josie was a betrayal. However, he consoled himself with the thought that their connection had helped him cope with stress and improve his mood in his relationship with Louise. Despite the growing feeling of guilt, their meetings began to occur irregularly, but always spontaneously. Sometimes this happened 2 or 3 times in a couple of days, sometimes they did not see each other for a whole week. One day, they even decided to meet outside of work hours when Louise went to see her sister. However, their attempt to spend the evening together was unsuccessful during dinner at a restaurant. Both felt that their communication was too reminiscent of a date, which led to an unexpected turn in their relationship. At dinner, Josie suddenly said, "I think I'll go home alone today." John agreed, noting that everything that was happening seemed wrong. In the conversation, he admitted that his connection with Josie somehow helped him feel freer and even improve his relationship with his wife. Josie supported him, assuring him that for her it was all just a game and she was not looking for a relationship. After these words, their evening took an unexpected turn. Josie gave him a gift, which turned out to be a kind of symbol of her control, a device that limited his freedom. She asked John to wear it at home to prove his devotion to her. Later, left alone, John thought for a long time about her request. Despite his internal resistance, he understood that her influence on him was too great to refuse. He complied with her request, hoping that it would strengthen their unusual relationship. But at the same time, he was aware that her control over him would now be felt even when he was next to his wife. These thoughts did not leave him, and he anxiously awaited where this would all lead. John lay in bed again, thinking about Louise and how to keep his secret without her finding out. He was sure that he would succeed. They had long moved away from each other, and her interest in their intimacy had disappeared. His thoughts turned to Josie, her influence over him and her control. He wondered if he would let her go further and if he could stop her if she started to cross the line. Remembering her last instructions, John picked up his phone and took a few photos to send to Josie, hoping she'd like them. Across town, Josie was at home thinking about a new experience she had discovered. She felt pleasure from her influence over John and wondered how far she could go without hurting anyone. Her interest in dominance grew not as something cruel, but as a way to control the situation. However, she was tormented by mixed feelings. She saw it as both fun and risky. She thought about Louise, her role in John's life, and how all this might affect her. Louise always seemed like a kind person to her, and this made Josie feel guilty. She understood that her actions could disturb their family peace. However, Josie tried to justify herself, thinking that she was giving John what he lacked without destroying his family. Meanwhile, Louise was away from home. At night, she could not sleep, thinking about her life with John. She recalled their conversations about how perhaps he should have another woman to make up for the lack of intimacy. Although the thought of it was unpleasant to her, she considered it one of the possible solutions to their problem. She felt guilty about their distance, but also didn't know how to change it. Tired of heavy thoughts, she decided to talk to John about this topic when she returned home. The next morning, John was faced with problems associated with Josie's instructions and tried to adapt to his new conditions. At work, when he saw Josie, he tried to discuss the situation with her, but she easily deflected the conversation, making it clear that she did not intend to change her rules. John was confused, but did not dare to go against her will. All day his thoughts were not on work, but on finding ways to please Josie and maintain calm in his relationship with Louise. 9 hours later, John watched Louise walk towards him along the station platform. He was amazed at how beautiful, elegant, and sophisticated she looked. He imagined that anyone who saw her would think she was a model or a movie star. He stood with a stupid smile, waiting for her to come up. She noticed him, smiled, and waved at him. He felt like a teenager meeting his first girlfriend and rushed to hug his wife. "Did you miss me?" she asked as he took her small travel bag. "Very," he answered, and could not resist kissing her passionately. Louise blushed when their kiss broke and gently ran her hand over his face. "Oh, you really missed me." They kissed again, but this time more subdued, and, holding hands, headed to the car. Both were happy to be together again, but each had their own thoughts and worries. Louise chatted non-stop while John drove, telling him all the family news. He nodded and answered at the right times, but he didn't really follow the conversation much. The constant feeling of pressure in his groin area reminded him of his new situation. Yesterday, everything seemed so simple, but as he now realized, it was due to the excitement of what was happening and the realization that he was alone at home. Now it bothered him. He thought it would be easy to keep this secret from Louise and generally remained confident of it, but for how long? If he had known that this was temporary, that it was just Josie's game for a day or two, he would not have doubted it. But she hinted that it could drag on, that it could become permanent. And although the very thought of it excited him, and even now excites him, he felt that it was only a matter of time before something went wrong and everything was revealed. John glanced at his wife. She was silent, looking out the window. A sudden feeling of guilt overcame him, pushing all previous concerns into the background. How could he cheat on such a wonderful woman? Yes, she had her shortcomings, and one of them, fear of sex, caused this whole situation, but it was not her fault. She definitely didn't deserve such betrayal. He loved her more than anything in the world. Loved enough to overcome his addiction to what Josie did to him. With renewed determination, he decided that it would all end today. As soon as they get home, he will get rid of Josie's gift, and on Monday, he will tell Josie that it's all over. With these thoughts, he felt a little better. To make amends a little, he stopped at a Chinese restaurant to order Louise's favorite food. John's father was a man with an alcohol addiction. Despite this, he was a good man who died at the age of only 55. Doctors said the cause was a weak heart, but John was sure alcohol played a role. His father, Brian, struggled with his addiction, but always ended up returning to the bottle. This did not stop John from loving him, but sometimes he felt angry at his weakness. He remembered coming home as a teenager to find his father drunk, sometimes in the middle of the day. This made him furious and desperate. What kind of illness was this if he couldn't just say no? Now, thinking about his father, John realized that he himself was no better, and perhaps worse. It was Saturday evening. He stood in the shower, closing his eyes and putting his face under the stream of warm water. He had plenty of opportunity to use the tools in the garage and get rid of Josie's gift. He even went there on Friday evening, right after he picked Louise up from the station. But at that moment, his resolve deserted him. Turning off the water, John stepped out of the shower, took a large terry towel, and began to dry himself. Then he sat on the edge of the bathtub, wrapping a towel around his waist, and thought. On Monday, he planned to talk to Josie, explain that this situation was causing problems, and convince her to release him. Perhaps she will agree to lock him only in the office, once or twice a week. He wouldn't mind if she even demanded to satisfy her. In fact, the idea of doing this while she was playing the dominant role seemed incredibly sexy to him. But then he remembered Louise again, how unfair life had been to her, and how his betrayal only added to her pain. He remembered his vow to stop lying, to return to the role of a loving, faithful husband, even if he was frustrated. This last thought came unexpectedly. A smiling Josie appeared before his eyes again, with her sexy, mocking smile. She would laugh at his weakness, perhaps even come up with something new, more cruel and exciting to complicate his life. John felt growing discomfort and groaned. The thought of Josie controlling him was making him horny again, which was completely inappropriate. With another groan and a silent curse, he lowered his head into his hands. After a few minutes, John stood up, the air cold on his damp body. He knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure of his decision or whether he had the strength to carry it out. But at least his condition has become more comfortable. He wiped his damp arms and chest with the towel again and headed towards the door and into the bedroom. He walked to the doorway and stopped, because he always closed the door when he used the bathroom, and he was sure that he did it this time, but the door stood ajar, just a couple of centimeters. He tried to remember if he had closed the door, but it was such a minor action that it probably didn't register in his mind, and really, did it matter? He shrugged, unconcerned, and went into the bedroom to get dressed. Louise was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched and cooling. She tried to make sense of what she saw. Perhaps she should have talked to her husband right away, but this time she was speechless. She had heard stories of wives or husbands accidentally discovering a secret, an affair or something similar, but this was something else that completely surprised her, stunned her, and made her retreat as if it were her fault. She only needed hand cream, and she knew that John was in the shower, but she went into the bathroom anyway. It was a normal thing, like any couple. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the tiles of the wall, his head raised, water pouring onto his face. Louise smiled as she studied him. He was still handsome and fit. His body remained strong and muscular, as in the first days of meeting him, a very attractive and charming man. She secretly watched him for a few seconds, then reached for the cream. But when she turned to the door, her angle of view changed, and she saw something that shocked her. But now, as she waited to talk to her husband, Louise began to doubt what she had seen. She could not understand why he did this. What could it mean? She couldn't imagine that he did this for himself. What was the point? This meant only one thing. Someone else was involved, someone close enough to convince him to use the special device. But maybe she was imagining everything. The shower screen was covered with water droplets and steam, so it wasn't completely transparent. Could she be wrong? Prudently, she decided not to approach directly, instead giving him the opportunity to explain himself, to prove his innocence if necessary, without the need for confrontation. The sound of footsteps from above told Louise that John had finished his shower. Leaving the coffee untouched, she walked into the living room, trying to decide how to approach the problem. "Hey, handsome, want to have a nice evening?" Louise said hoarsely as John entered the room. She suddenly felt insecure. Acting attractive to her husband was one thing, but pretending to be someone she wasn't was another. But while her nervousness was beneath the surface, John's nervousness was clearly palpable. And as Louise approached him, she thought she saw a faint hint of panic in his eyes. He stood transfixed in place as she wrapped her arms around his shoulders. She kissed him once and playfully ran her tongue over his lips, pressing herself close, moving gracefully like a dancer. In any case, she felt a growing irrational fear and a strong desire to withdraw. It took her a lot of effort to control the growing panic and keep her voice calm. "Is this a hard object in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" she whispered in his ear. John was stunned and fell silent. Somehow she knew he was sure of it. Why else would she act like that? Why would she mention a hard subject, especially on a day like this? How did she know? Did she look in the bathroom? And he remembered how the door was slightly open. But that didn't matter now. The problem was how he could explain himself. His mind was spinning, and he didn't know what to say. Instinctively, he pulled away. Louise breathed a sigh of relief. The horror in her mind intensified, and she did not know how much longer she could stand his presence. But she was also disappointed and felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She felt that his rejection confirmed her suspicions. He was definitely hiding something, and what she saw in the bathroom was not just her imagination. She managed to maintain her composure, pursing her lips in a way she thought was attractive, but also giving herself time to hold back her tears. "You don't love me anymore?" she asked, pouting her lips, and seeing the expression on his face, nervousness and guilt, she realized that her fears were confirmed, and suddenly she felt ashamed to continue pretending. "Of course I do. I'm just tired. It was a hard day," John answered evasively. In his confusion, this was the first thing he could think of. But he knew that it was hopeless. There was no way out. He felt his life and marriage crumble around him. "Tired? But you didn't do anything today, or am I not doing this for you anymore?" Louise said and half-heartedly approached again, but she knew the damage had already been done. "No. Yes. This. I can't." Her demeanor changed, and she looked him in the face. "Can't?" she whispered, now confident in her knowledge and increasingly angry. "What? What's wrong with you?" "I thought I was the problem," she said dismissively, and this time she pulled away with determination. "No, I mean—" John was clearly embarrassed, but Louise clenched her fists and took a deep breath, pulling away, not trusting herself not to hit him. "So what exactly do you mean?" she said coldly, sitting down on the sofa and crossing one leg over the other, folding her arms, keeping her knee raised. She looked up, questioning, tilting her head to the side. She watched her husband awkwardly try to say something, part of her enjoying his discomfort. When he didn't respond, she decided to finish the matter. "Maybe it has something to do with what you're wearing." "W what? W where?" he answered with uncertainty. He was exposed, he knew it, and she knew he knew it, so he didn't need to explain. She just looked at his clothes and raised her eyebrows, with a small smirk of triumph on her face. John swallowed and dried the linden, thinking desperately. He could deny everything, perhaps feign innocence, appear uncaring, and pretend it was all a joke, but he knew it would be in vain. He needed something believable, but what? What kind of ridiculous excuse could there be for wearing such a device? "Well, the thing is, dear, I wanted to see what it was like to be restrained, so that I couldn't touch it, to feel discomfort every time I had the urge, because I was stupid and thought it would be interesting." Yes, as if she would believe it, so he decided to confess it was the only way out. But he tried to do it evasively, explain his disappointment, perhaps shift some of the responsibility onto her and hope, pray that she would forgive. "It's not what it seems," he said, but immediately regretted his words. Louise jerked her head back in mock surprise. "Oh God, did you really say that? So tell me, what does this even look like?" She replied sarcastically, her voice rising with anger. "Okay, if I must know, it's because of you I tried, but you never." He desperately tried to take a higher position, but Louise denied him. "Don't blame me, I'm not the one who cheats, and I'm not the one who wears this device," she said loudly and confidently. His wife's unusual obscene language and words about the device shocked John. He never suspected that she knew what it was, and it completely unsettled him. He sank into despondency. His whole body seemed to sag. "Sorry. Apparently I was angry with you. I know what you don't like, and I respect that and try to live with it. I love you so much, but, well, I just needed to let off some steam, relieve the tension." Louise wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she liked intimacy. He knew she did. She just couldn't. She was broken, faulty. But she managed to calm down and remembered how she herself suggested that he take a mistress. But these were just words spoken out of guilt. She didn't mean to, and she certainly didn't want him to go behind her back. Instead, she said, "How many times?" but in a much more subdued tone than she felt. "W what?" John said, trying to put his thoughts in order. "How many times have you had to let off steam?" she demanded. John briefly considered lying, telling Louise it was only once or twice, but decided to stick to the truth, even if it hurt her more. "Don't know, I didn't count." "You don't know? 10, 20 more? How many times have you lost count?" she said, and took another deep breath before continuing. "How long has this been going on? When did it start?" John looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. 3 months, he muttered. Louise suddenly stood up and went to the kitchen. John waited, not knowing what she was planning. He caught a glimpse of a terrible vision of her with a large meat cutter, and God knows he probably deserved it, but he pushed the thought away. She returned a few minutes later with a glass of wine and leaned against the doorway. "So, I think we should get to the point. Who is she? And why are you wearing this device?" she said, pointing her finger and expressing disgust. "It's Josie," he muttered again. "Speak louder, I can't hear you." "This is Josie, my assistant." "I know who Josie's," Louise said sharply, then forced herself to calm down again and took a long sip of wine. "It's strange, I really like her. I'm more disappointed in her than angry," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's my fault, not hers. It's not her fault," John said quickly, seeing no reason why Josie should bear any blame. Of course, she is to blame. She knew you were married, damn it. She knows me. We are almost friends. It's not that you forced her. She fell silent and narrowed her eyes. You didn't force it, did you? You didn't threaten or anything. No, of course not. What do you think of me? He protested and immediately regretted his question. But Louise didn't take advantage of this. Instead, she remained calm and in control, which made John even more nervous. No, I don't think you threatened her, or why would you be locked up? She said, more to herself than to John, but then decided to find out. So, just why exactly are you wearing this device? John sat up and ran his hand over his face, trying to buy time. He was surprised that Louise knew what it was. He had always considered her rather naive and had never thought that she understood such things. Perhaps he did not know his wife as well as he thought, and this somehow upset him. But he was wondering what to say, how best to explain his unusual relationship with Josie when Louise surprised him again. Show me, she said. At first John did not understand and looked at his wife with empty eyes. Her lips were pursed, and there was a slight smile on her face. Slowly, she raised her hand and twirled one finger as if weaving a spell, then pointed to his area. Show me. What? Please, Lou, this is embarrassing, John said, stuttering. The satisfied expression disappeared, and she raised her head, looked into his eyes, then slowly and decisively demanded, Show me this device. John tensed at the force of her words. He sat on the edge of his chair, upright and nervous, in contrast to his wife's relaxed posture. Throughout their marriage, they had been equal in everything, but at that moment he realized that she was leading and did not dare disobey her. That's why I showed it. This is embarrassing, he said with one last pleading look, squeezing his belt and hoping she would back down. Yes, I suppose so, she said without sympathy, giving up. He looked up and saw Louise observing his inappropriate behavior and exhaled deeply. Then, not wanting to see her expression, he closed his eyes and allowed her to examine his new attribute. Louise briefly examined the device, even moving closer to get a better look, although she was still at a safe distance. It was a sight that would normally have caused her to panic, causing her to freeze in fear. But suddenly it looked harmless, no longer threatening, and she realized she wasn't afraid, at least not as afraid as usual. The limited device couldn't harm her, and she felt a strange, but not unwanted, warmth. Does it hurt? She asked. She spoke in an indifferent tone, slightly embarrassed and not wanting to show her feelings. A little, sometimes, when I have. You know, he explained, and Louise nodded in understanding. How is it now? She said and couldn't help but smile. John looked at himself, surprised. Despite the humiliation and guilt, he actually felt relieved again. He didn't understand why this was happening and couldn't explain it. He had been caught in a lie and was now desperately trying to save his marriage. The situation wasn't erotic at all, so why did he feel relieved? So, I guess the question is, why are you wearing this? She asked. John took a few seconds to clear his thoughts before answering. Can I sit down first? He asked, still feeling exposed. Louise was glad that he asked permission. It gave her a feeling of superiority that she liked and was determined to enjoy. No, she said decisively. John sighed and remained where he was. It's not easy to admit, but it's somehow interesting to me, he said, unable to meet her gaze. When she didn't answer, he knew he would have to explain himself further. Josie likes to be in charge. She leads, I follow, he said. I'm not saying it's all her fault, but she just likes it when I submit to her, and I think I like it too, he added. What is she doing? Asked Louise. She controls me, tells me what to do and how to do certain things, John replied. It was difficult to accurately describe the situation. She just started giving me commands and I obeyed, he said calmly. Which things exactly? John knew that Louise wanted to know everything, so he did not hide it. Everything related to intimacy. How should I communicate with her? How should I ask permission to meet? She likes it when I'm submissive. She calls me her subordinate, he said, looking at her face. He was determined not to turn away. And you liked it too? John simply nodded, unable to admit it in words. Is she hurting you? Do I imagine her with any means of influence? Asked Louise. John wasn't sure if she was serious, but he understood why she might think that. No, nothing like that. She's not cruel, she just likes to be in control, he replied and turned away. So how did it all start? Did you seduce her? Asked Louise. No, it was. He hesitated, trying to find the words. It was an accident, an accident. I see. Did you meet by chance? Louise clarified. John almost laughed and looked sharply at his wife, but she looked serious. No, we actually ran into each other. And he shrugged, as if that explained everything. Go on, said Louise. Obviously, she wanted to know the details, so John decided to tell everything except how he was attracted to Josie in the first place. Louise knew that Josie was attracted to him. She had mentioned it a while ago, and he remembered her warning to be careful. But the damage had been done, and now he had to bear the consequences. We started dating, he said. It just happened. None of us planned it. He waited for a reaction, which did not come, so he continued. There was mutual affection between us. But we knew it was wrong, so we didn't do anything at first. And then one morning we bumped into each other again, literally, and it all started. I held her so she wouldn't fall, and we stayed together for a moment. I don't know who made the first move, but we kissed, and then we didn't stop. Was this in your office? Louise asked, sounding partly surprised, partly sad. Yes, he admitted, raising his head and looking at the ceiling, but then managed to meet her gaze. It was wrong, we both knew it and tried to stop, but it was new and exciting for both of us. We didn't know what to do, so she suggested we go to her house, and I couldn't resist. It was the first time, and then I felt guilty, but after a couple of days I don't remember who exactly, suggested we repeat it, and I wanted to stop, I really wanted to, and so did she, but each time the guilt became easier to ignore. I told myself that this was the last time, but... So she forced you, or was it your idea? Louise interrupted her. Her anger subsided somewhat, and she began to think clearly. She seemed to understand the situation, but didn't want to hear all the details. However, she was still a little uncomfortable and needed to know the basics before deciding what to do next. No, it was Josie. She told me to do it, but only last Thursday, I swear, he said, as if that made the situation better. He felt like he was drowning, swimming against the current and slowly being carried under the water while Louise calmly watched. And you just agreed? John nodded, feeling insignificant again. It turned me on, he muttered. Speak up, I can't hear you, she reminded me. John again couldn't meet her gaze. Confessing his true feelings was as difficult as anything he had said before. I loved it. I liked being under her control, her dominance. I realized that I love being controlled, he said, feeling ashamed of his confession. Louise felt a small wave of sadness, wondering why he had never shown her this side of himself, why he had never reached out to her. But she didn't ask. Why this particular toy? What was the reason? You suddenly realized that you liked being submissive, but what did she get from it? Why did she imprison you? Or did she just want to demonstrate her superiority? I think so. Like most of the things she did and the things she made me do, she just liked it when I obeyed. But I think it was also a test so she could trust me. Louise was surprised. Why didn't she trust you? She thought she understood the situation, but didn't want to hear the dirty details. However, she was still a little annoyed and needed to know the basics before deciding what to do next. John hesitated, not knowing if Louise would become even more upset, but he had already gone too far to stop, so he didn't lie anymore. I told her about us, that we were no longer close, he said, then quickly added. I didn't say why, just that we weren't close. He waited for a reaction, but Louise just tilted her head, indicating that he should continue. I guess she needed proof, so. This was her test, and he awkwardly pointed at the control device. I see, Louise said, then stood up to get another bottle of wine. She swayed a little. The alcohol was taking effect, but she didn't care. John was still standing there when she returned a few minutes later and sat down, thinking in silence. John fidgeted nervously. Her silence bothered him, and he felt the need to say something. "You never wanted me, and I hated it when we tried because I knew how hard it was for you. I couldn't stand the thought of hurting you. I don't know, I thought I would save you from difficulties." He fell silent. Louise took a sip of wine. In a strange way, she understood what he was trying to say. Her problem was not John's fault, and it was hard for him too, perhaps even more so. Since her difficulties began, she had at least sometimes received relief, but she was never completely satisfied. There were always too many thoughts in her head to finally relax. Each time the fear became stronger, and she just wanted to stop trying. But then she thought, what about satisfying John? He'd always insisted it didn't matter, but she couldn't remember how many times he'd sneaked into the bathroom thinking she was asleep, making her feel almost as guilty as he probably felt now. And it all came to this. She remembered the times when she had considered convincing him to take a mistress, how she had hinted at it, even openly suggested it once. But she never thought that he would do this, especially secretly, and now she did not know whether it was good or bad, but it did not bring her joy. Although she had to admit that things had been getting better between them in recent weeks, both had been less tense, coinciding with the time he had been dating Josie, and now she understood why. She wondered how she had not suspected, and why she was surprised that it had actually happened. She stood up, holding her glass, her thoughts clearing. Her anger softened to irritation, not because of what he had done, but rather because he had not been honest with her, had not shared with her. "So you agreed to this to keep us faithful while you cheat on me," said Louise, slowly walking around her husband, like a prosecutor interrogating the accused. "And somehow you convinced yourself that this was saving our marriage. Is that what I'm thinking?" John nodded guiltily, but realized that Louise had turned away from him, and muttered, "Yes, but it wasn't that simple. There was more." "Yeah, she ordered you and you obeyed," she said, letting out a fake laugh. "You know, I never thought you had a side like this. You never acted in a submissive way, not with me, or maybe I wasn't dominant enough for you. But apparently, I'm just a stupid housewife." "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't understand it myself until then. And you never showed interest, you were always too. I'm sorry, I honestly thought." But he couldn't find the words to explain himself. "I don't believe you really thought about it, at least not consciously. So where are we going now?" Louise said, lowering her empty glass and pouring herself another. She took a deep breath and waved her free hand in exasperation. "It's strange, but I can understand your logic, no matter how confusing it is, but that doesn't mean I agree with it. It looks like I need to seriously think about what will happen next." "Please, Lou, don't go. I don't want to lose you. I'll do whatever you say if you forgive me," John begged, knowing he sounded pathetic, but he didn't care. "Be careful what you say. I haven't decided what I'll do yet, but if we stay together, I might need more than you're willing to give," she warned. She didn't know why she said it or what she meant, but it seemed appropriate. "I'm serious, Lou, anything. I'll do anything. I'm serious." "Please," he said, and actually knelt down. Louise turned away from him, losing patience with both herself and John, and needed time to think. "Forget it," she said sharply. She wanted to insult him, like tell him to leave, but she realized that he took her words literally when she felt his face behind her a few seconds later. She twitched a little in surprise and at first wanted to turn away, but did not. Perhaps it was under the influence of alcohol. She didn't know, but she also felt a surge of energy. Whatever it was, she liked it and gave into it. "Do it right," she said in a commanding tone, but she couldn't hide the slight tremor in her voice. John raised his head, his face close to hers. She stood over him, not bothering to meet his gaze. He felt small and inferior, but at the same time he experienced internal tension. He did this not just as an act of submission, but to show his love for her and to try to earn her forgiveness. For her part, Louise did not understand the emotions running through her. She should have been angry at her husband, but instead she felt excited. She took a deep breath, but managed to maintain control. Where are you going? Louise asked without turning around, causing him to stop. Uh, sorry, I thought we were done, he said, feeling himself shrink under her gaze. I was going to the garage. I need to put some tools away. No, you stay here and that still applies. Until I make a decision, you only do what I say. Is it clear? Louise said sternly. She sounded completely confident, but inside she was anything but. Still, she held his gaze until he looked away. Why, yes, okay, John answered timidly. You can think about what you did. Meanwhile, I'm going to bed. I have a lot to think about. You will sleep in the guest room, and with that she left, leaving him standing, nervous and unsure of his future. John sat down on the sofa, feeling suddenly tired. He could hear Louise moving around the apartment, but he didn't dare go upstairs, knowing that he didn't have the will or the courage to face her, at least for a while. He tried to convince himself that he was just giving her time and space to cool down. He considered calling Josie to tell her what had happened, but realized that probably wasn't the best idea. Rubbing his face, he sat back down on the couch with his head down, groaning as he anticipated what tomorrow would bring. Louise took a shower and brushed her teeth. She put on her nightgown and climbed into bed, tormented by a million thoughts. She understood that John deserved to be punished, but leaving him was not part of her plans. It would cause her as much pain as it did him. Staying angry wasn't healthy either, but just forgiving him didn't seem right. He needed a lesson, something that would make him realize his mistake and stay where he belonged. Then she remembered how she felt when he showed his submission, how pleasant it was, and how excited she was that he was ready to submit. She wondered if Josie felt the same way, knowing that he would do anything, follow any orders, and she wondered if she could be as dominant. She again saw the image of John ready to submit to her, and an idea began to form in her head. John woke up early the next morning. He needed to go to the bathroom, but decided to use the guest bathrooms, not yet ready to face Louise, and thought that serving her tea and toast in bed might help. He brushed his teeth and walked into the kitchen to find that she was already there. "Hi, honey, did you sleep well?" He greeted her cheerfully. Not really," he replied, her friendly demeanor surprising him and making him even more nervous. "The tea is ready. Pour me some more, please," she said, pushing her empty cup towards the table. John nodded. There was so much he wanted to say, but he didn't trust himself to speak for fear of ruining her good mood. So he poured Louise more tea, then took a cup for himself and sat down opposite her at the table. It was something he had done countless times before, but this time it felt different, as if he was obligated to serve, like a servant, or more precisely, as if Louise was to be served. And when he looked at her, her expression showed that she felt it too. "I'm going to go out later. I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I want you to be here when I get back," Louise said before taking a sip of tea. "Yes, of course. Why, where are you going?" John answered. He tried to sound calm, but thinking about what she planned to do alone after the events of the previous evening made him anxious. "I need to meet someone at." She looked at her watch to check the time. "In less than an hour. Then I thought I'd go visit Josie and talk a little," she said with a smile. John couldn't think of anything worse. "Oh no, Lou, please don't do this. Put the blame on me. It's really not her fault," he said hastily. "Oh, don't worry. You're not out of this yet. For now, I just want to talk to her, settle a few issues," she said. John imagined his wife breaking into Josie's apartment and starting an argument, possibly threatening her and calling the police. "Please don't do this. Don't act rashly. I don't want you to get in trouble because of my mistake," he pleaded. "Oh, I think we both agree that it was more than a mistake, don't you think?" she said, raising her eyebrows and smiling slightly mockingly. He wanted to argue, but she continued before John could respond. "Don't worry, I'm not mad anymore. I'm just going to talk," and stood up, taking her tea with her. "Who else are you dating?" John asked, causing her to hesitate at the door. "Emily," she replied, adding nothing more. Emily was the therapist Louise had last seen about 8 or 9 months ago. John wondered why Louise wanted to see her now. Obviously, this was related to what happened, but do GPS work on Sunday mornings? He was more confused and scared than ever. "Louise," he called, stopping her again. She leaned back, looking around the door, a knowing smile on her face. John wanted to talk more, to find out. What? But she seemed to enjoy it, he could tell. She enjoyed his discomfort, and he knew he deserved it. "I love you," he said quietly. Louise softened her smile and nodded once before disappearing upstairs. 2 hours later, Louise arrived at the bright blue door of Josie's apartment. She was nervous, but surprisingly confident, was confident that her plan was better for everyone involved. Removing an elegant leather glove from her right hand, she brushed her hair back and pressed the bell. "Louise, what a surprise," Josie said as she opened the door. It was obvious that she was not expecting guests. Dressed in warm pajamas and a loose robe, her feet were wearing slippers with fluffy bunny ears. "Hello, Josie. Sorry for the trouble, especially on Sunday. I understand if this is inconvenient." Josie hesitated for a second, then buttoned her robe and stepped back. "No, it's okay. Come in." Leading her into the living room, Josie waved her hand for Louise to sit down. At first, she thought that something might have happened to John, or maybe she accidentally found out about their relationship. But Louise didn't seem particularly upset anyway, so she asked, "How can I help?" Curious about the reason for the unexpected visit, but then remembered her manners. "Would you like something to drink? Tea, coffee, maybe wine?" "Wine is tempting, but I'd rather stick with tea," said Louise, settling down on the soft sofa. "So is this just a visit, or is there something?" Josie began, heading towards the open door to the kitchen, but Louise interrupted her. "No, I wanted to talk to you. John told me everything about you, about what you do," she said matter-of-factly and directly. "Oh," Josie stopped and turned around slowly. She was taken by surprise, but managed to hide her surprise and shock. "Apparently you've been communicating for the past few months," said Louise. She clutched her bag, but that was the only sign of tension. Otherwise, she looked calm, even with a slight smile, tilted head, and raised eyebrows. Josie glanced at the door, perhaps thinking about making a quick exit. "I didn't come here to quarrel. I just want to talk, woman to woman." Josie hesitated, scratching her head, and slowly walked back into the room. "Yeah, I don't know what to say, I'm sorry," she said more like a question and with an apologetic smile. But she didn't sound guilty, rather embarrassed at being put in an awkward position. "You?" asked Louise. Josie didn't answer at first, but sat down opposite the older woman. "Excuse me? Yes, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened, but—" She shrugged her shoulders in a what-can-be-done gesture. "But it wasn't John's fault, it was my fault," she said. "That's strange. He said the same thing about you," Louise remarked. Josie spread her arms, not seeming shaken by the revelation, and Louise admired her calmness. "Really, it was my mistake. I could have refused at any time, but I don't think John was strong enough to resist. I was the one who arranged everything. I was in control of the situation," she said. "So I take it this is where his little control device comes from?" Louise asked, shaking the little finger of her right hand. Josie laughed nervously at the gesture, despite the serious situation. "I never thought of him as little," she said. Louise seemed to soften a little. "No, he's not small. I'm just kidding," she said with a smile. "Do you love him?" she suddenly asked. Josie stuttered slightly with laughter. "Love John? God, no." "Well, not in the sense that you understand," she shook her head and sighed. "It was really just a relationship. I know it sounds cliché, but it's true. You probably think I'm frivolous, and you're probably right. I liked this relationship. There was an attraction between us, and we took advantage of it. It shouldn't have turned out this way. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to offend anyone." And for the first time, she sounded regretful. "Why did you make him wear this device? I guess you really forced him. I can't imagine him agreeing to it himself." Josie thought for a moment before answering. "I think I really forced him. Although physically, damn, he's a lot bigger than me," she laughed. "I just told him to put it on, and he did." Josie smiled shyly. "Well, I thought it would be more convenient, and I liked it when he did what I asked." Yes, he told me. Apparently, he liked being told what to do too, Louise said. Did he tell you that we were having problems? You know, our relationship? Asked Louise. Josie nodded in agreement. Yes, he did, but I'm not sure if I believed him. That was part of the reason I made him wear the device. And besides, don't all men talk like that when they... She made a face, hoping to convey her meaning. I think they probably say it, but this time it was true, Louise said. We haven't been intimate for over 2 years, she explained, examining her hands, then looking into Josie's eyes. Have you ever heard of a phobia of male organs? She asked. Josie just looked at her with a blank expression, not sure where this was going, but feeling like it was important, at least for Louise. No, Louise said, seeing the other side's lack of understanding, and explained, it's a medical condition, fear or aversion to intimacy, but more importantly, fear of direct sex. And I have it. Josie started, her expression adamant, not knowing what to say. Then, after a minute in which neither woman spoke, she finally said, I better make this tea. About 2.5 years ago, I developed an infection on my female side, Louise said. Josie sat and listened intently, holding a cup of tea in both hands. I needed a minor operation, nothing major, and we thought everything was fine. But then the doctors said I would probably never have children. Louise paused and took a sip of her tea, shaking off a threatening tear of self-pity, and Josie reached out to squeeze her hand in sympathy. Louise was slightly embarrassed and smiled. We still tried. I think we wanted to prove the doctors wrong, but we tried too early, too hard. It hurt me. I don't know, I think I wasn't restored enough, or maybe it was all designed that way. Anyway, I was stubborn and thought I knew what was best for me, but every time we tried it became more and more painful. I really can't describe how painful it was. It was completely unbearable, so we had to stop trying. Talking about this was more difficult than Louise imagined. She stared at the cup in her hand and Josie sat down next to her. It started out as purely physical, and luckily I recovered within a few months, she continued after a thoughtful pause. But mentally, I was broken. You see, when we finally tried again, when I thought my body was ready, the memory of how painful it was still with me. I never knew if it would still hurt because I just couldn't continue. My body is healed, but my mind is not. It turns out I have a phobia. Can't anything be done about this? What do the doctors say? Josie asked with real concern. At first, they said it was just a matter of time, that the fear would subside and disappear, but if anything, it only got worse. It's not something you can just take a pill, it's all here, Louise said, tapping her temple with her finger. What about therapy? Asked Josie. Louise shook her head and smiled faintly. I went to therapists, 3 actually. I still see one sometimes when the going gets tough. I even tried hypnotherapy, but I was not receptive. John and I kept telling ourselves that everything would be okay, but I think we both knew it was hopeless. I have come to terms with the fact that I will not have children. It is not uncommon, and there is always hope or some other solution to motherhood. I even convinced myself that I could manage without intimacy, but for John it was more difficult. She paused to take the last sip of tea, then looked at the empty cup, as if wondering what it was. Could you have a glass of wine now? Just a little one, Louise said, putting the cup down on the table. Josie nodded in response and collected the empty cups. In the kitchen, while opening the glass cabinet, she noticed that Louise had followed her. She took an already opened bottle of white wine from the refrigerator and poured it, then handed the glass to Louise. You said things got worse for John, she asked, taking a sip. Louise's story caught her attention, and she wanted to hear more. When she first arrived, Louise knew what she was planning. She felt confident and in control, but describing her problems was more difficult than she imagined. But it was time to assert herself again, to take back control, so she casually leaned against the doorframe, ready, and it was time to explain the real reason for the visit. The fault was on my side, she said. I knew this and learned to live with it. But the hardest part was the guilt. John didn't do anything wrong, and it was like he was being punished, even though it was all my fault. No, It wasn't your fault. You didn't control it. You were just as much a victim, maybe even more. Louise raised her hand, palm facing out. I know. Everything is fine. I've already experienced all this a million times. I don't blame anyone. I don't blame myself either. But in the end, it was me. I was the one with the problem. She took another sip and savored the taste before letting the wine flow down her throat. Can you imagine what that must have been like for him? He had all the needs and aspirations of any other person, and a wife who couldn't even look at him, let alone make contact, without having a panic attack. Standing up straight, Louise held out her empty glass, inviting him to pour another. Josie obeyed the signal, pouring only a little. He was so good, so patient. He never complained or tried to make me feel guilty. I even suggested that he find someone just to... She waved her hand to mean, you know, someone like you. Josie thought about it, implying that Louise thought she was frivolous or slutty. She wasn't sure, but gave her the benefit of the doubt. Someone like me? She asked. Louise bowed her head and pursed her lips. I said that he should find someone to meet several times, a girlfriend maybe, but he refused. It made me proud of him. I thought he was so brave to make such a sacrifice, she sighed deeply, but he wasn't as brave and strong as I thought. What are you trying to say, Louise? I thought you came here to dissuade me, but now it seems that you are telling me. I don't know. What do you want? Josie said, still feeling sympathy for Louise, but not understanding where the conversation was going. Louise took a breath and stood tall and straight. Okay, she said. Yes, I was angry when I found out about you, but I'm not too surprised. I guess I just never thought that he would go behind my back. The thing is, when I saw this device and he told me what you did, how you control it, I became more curious than angry, and I also became jealous. Jealous that he didn't do this for me, but I guess I never gave him a reason, she said sadly. But I also discovered something. I realized that with him this way, I'm no longer afraid. His behavior can't hurt me. I understand, Josie said. She thought she understood, but still wondered what Louise was planning. Louise placed her glass on the table and clasped her hands together, showing nervousness. On the way here, I went to see my therapist. She confirmed my thoughts. It's not sex itself, but my fear of it. But when I saw him in this position, I suddenly realized. It can't harm me. I'm not afraid anymore. I suddenly realized that if I continued to control him, keep him where he couldn't hurt me, maybe everything would be okay. I could at least have some kind of intimacy. Josie nodded and smiled in understanding. You want the key. Do you want to keep it under control? She said. Louise smiled too and waved her hand. Well, not really. I have already said how unfair everything was for him. I don't want to make the situation worse, so I have a proposal for you. The TV was showing a rerun of an old sitcom and John sat and watched, but didn't look. His mind was elsewhere, wondering and worrying what Louise was doing. He considered calling Josie shortly after Louise left 4 hours ago, but decided against it, feeling it would only make things worse. Josie was special to him, very special, but Louise was the love of his life, and he couldn't and wouldn't live without her. So he prayed for everything to work out, promising a God he didn't believe in that he would do anything if she would just forgive him. If she left him, he really didn't see how he could continue. So he sat on the edge of his chair, trying in vain to occupy his mind, when he suddenly jumped when he heard the key turn in the lock of their front door, signaling Louise's return. He stood up nervously, fingers crossed in hope, waiting for her to appear. Hey, did you get along? He asked when Louise finally entered the living room. He knew it was a ridiculous question. How could they even get along? But he was so agitated by nerves and tension that he blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. Louise did not answer immediately and seemed in no hurry to answer his question, casually taking off and laying the light jacket she was wearing on the back of her chair. She didn't look angry. On the contrary, she seemed to be in a good mood. We got along great, thank you, she said. John didn't want to press the topic, afraid she'd say something he didn't want to hear, something that could ruin his future with the woman he loved. But the uncertainty was killing him. He needed to know anyway. "So what happened?" he asked timidly, anticipating her answer. "We talked. Do you know how we women behave?" she said vaguely, crossing the room and settling into the chair in which he usually sat. "What did you tell her? You didn't quarrel, did you?" he asked, his question filled with worry and nervousness. "No, we didn't quarrel. We are women, we don't need to quarrel. We talk. In fact, everything went quite peacefully. Let's just say we came to an agreement." Agreement? John had no idea what she meant. Was she being deliberately evasive to prolong his torment? The uncertainty was driving him crazy. He needed to know what Louise decided. Did she forgive him? Has Josie forgiven? Is she planning, God forbid, to leave him? Does he still have a married life worth fighting for? He had to find out. He stood with his hands clasped as if in prayer. "Please, Louise, please tell me. Just don't leave me. I'm so sorry. I promise this won't happen again. I love you so much," he begged. Louise leaned back, crossed one leg over her knee, and placed her hands on the arms of the chair. She looked confident and in control, her lips half smiling, as if she knew a secret and was contemplating whether to reveal it. She casually tapped the fingers of her right hand as she looked at him. "I'm not going to leave you," she said, "but changes need to be made here." John felt his heart skip a beat, and he wanted to throw out the air joyfully, but he was able to restrain himself, although he could not hide his excitement. "Whatever, I will do whatever you say." "I hope you're serious," Louise said, stretching and recrossing her legs. "Yes, yes. Oh, Lou, thank you. I—" He hesitated, unable to express his joy in words. "Will you follow my instructions the same way you follow Josie's instructions?" She interrupted him. "Of course," he said, slightly puzzled, not quite understanding what she meant. "I'm serious, John, just like you do with Josie," she repeated. John swallowed and ran a hand over his face, wondering if Louise really meant what he thought she meant. "Of course not, she's not like that. Take off your clothes, all of them," she said firmly. The command came suddenly and decisively, and John froze, unsure if he had heard correctly. He stood up, wondering if he should laugh, wondering if this was a joke. But Louise simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for an answer. Yeah, okay, you got me," he said, confused. "I'm serious. I said things would be different," she said. "Now take off your clothes." The slight grin disappeared, replaced by a stern expression, and Louise's fingers continued to tap on the armrest of the chair, but now it looked more like impatience than idle fidgeting. John felt the gulp getting louder. He realized that she was really serious. What she was planning, he had no idea, but he had already said that he would do anything, and besides, was it really that bad to undress in front of his wife? He bit his lower lip, hoping she would say something, explain what she wanted, but her expression remained unchanged, and he knew he had to obey. Hesitantly, he took off his t-shirt, throwing it on the sofa. He hesitated. Louise had seen him naked 1,000 times, but standing there and undressing at her request, he felt more vulnerable than ever, even more than when she checked his device yesterday. "This is—" he began, spreading his arms in the hope that it would be enough, but he never finished. "That's it," Louise said. She sounded confident, but she had trouble controlling the trembling in her voice. This control and dominance over her husband was new and exciting for her. She had already experienced this yesterday when he knelt down and expressed his devotion, but then she did not understand. The strength and unexpected emotions surprised her. But now she had time to analyze and plan, and she was determined to continue with this new and exciting development. "I'm going to make changes in our relationship," she said calmly but firmly. "You will follow my instructions, and I will help you become a better person. Together, we can overcome all difficulties." John, although embarrassed, felt relieved and hopeful. He understood that this was a new stage in their marriage and was ready to do anything to save their relationship. "I'm ready, Louise. I will do everything that depends on me," he said sincerely. Louise smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Fine. Let's start with changes that will make us both happy." They stayed together, discussing how to improve their relationship and build mutual understanding. This was the first step towards a new beginning for their marriage. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.